Why is it that the person who sweats through double shifts, sacrifices sleep, and shows up even when their back is breaking, often walks home with the least? Why is it that those who mop the floors, lift the crates, serve the meals, and clean the wounds, the ones who make the world run, are the least rewarded in the eyes of society? And worse, why have we come to believe that they should be? There is a lie so deeply rooted in our culture that we barely notice it anymore. A lie that says your moral worth is tied to how hard you work, that virtue lives in labor, and that exhaustion is proof of goodness. This lie wears many masks: the grind set, the Protestant work ethic, the immigrant hustle, the blue-collar badge of honor. But at its heart is the same quiet cruelty. If you are poor, tired, or struggling, it must be because you are not working hard enough, or not the right way. This is the lie of moral labor, and it is old, far older than capitalism, communism, or the industrial age. Its roots reach back to feudal hierarchies, to religious doctrines, to philosophies that praised obedience and condemned idleness. In ancient Greece, manual labor was seen as fit only for slaves. In medieval Europe, peasants were told that toil was holy, and suffering was the path to heaven. Even today, in the age of automation and artificial intelligence, we cling to the myth that hustle equals value. But Friedrich Nietzsche, radical, razor-tongued, and unsparingly honest, saw through this. He called it out over a century ago, not just as an economic flaw, but as a spiritual sickness, a slave morality disguised as virtue. He dared to ask, who benefits from this belief? Who teaches it, and why? This video is not just about money. It is about meaning, about the way we value each other and ourselves. It is about the deep psychological conditioning that teaches people to feel ashamed for resting, guilty for wanting more, and afraid to question a system that rewards power, not effort. You will not find easy answers here, but you may find deeper questions, ones that linger long after the screen fades to black. Together, we will trace this myth across time and culture. We will explore how it shaped not just economies, but psyches. We will look at what modern psychology says about burnout, self-worth, and exploitation. And most of all, we will ask, how can we begin to tell a different story? Not one where the hardest workers are the lowest paid, but one where your worth is not measured by your suffering. Let us begin. To understand why the hardest workers often earn the least, we must look backwards, far, far backwards, before the skyscrapers and factories, before salaries and social contracts, because this imbalance, this strange and silent injustice, was not born in boardrooms. It was born in temples, in fields, in kingdoms ruled by blood and gods and fear. In ancient societies, labor was not celebrated. It was segregated. In ancient Greece, manual work was a marker of low status. The philosopher class, the thinkers, poets, and statesmen, considered physical labor a degradation. To labor with your hands was to submit to necessity, not to rise toward virtue. That was reserved for those with leisure, the time to read, to argue, to sculpt ideals from ideas. Slaves and the poor worked. The free and noble thought. Across the Mediterranean, Rome functioned in much the same way. Its empire was oiled by the blood and sweat of slaves, prisoners, and peasants. Yet this system did not see labor as noble. It saw it as natural for the lower class. Roman philosophers like Cicero wrote that labor done for hire is sordid and vulgar. Why? Because it was service to another. It lacked the dignity of autonomy. And so the first root of the myth was planted, that to work hard is not inherently honorable unless that work is done with freedom, intention, and power. And most workers had none of these. Then came Christianity, and with it a dramatic reframing. Where ancient elites looked down on labor, the early church sanctified it. Christ was a carpenter. His apostles were fishermen. Suffering became sacred. To toil was to imitate the divine. Poverty was not a curse but a passage to heaven. This was especially useful to those in power. Feudal lords found it convenient that peasants believed their suffering was holy. A lifetime of backbreaking harvests could be endured if it promised salvation. The Catholic Church did not simply spiritualize work, it moralized it. Monks rose before dawn to labor in silence, seeing toil as prayer. The Benedictine motto, Ora et labora, pray and work, spread across medieval Europe. Here we find the second root of the myth, that work itself is a form of moral cleansing, that exhaustion purifies, that idleness is sin. Then came the Protestant Reformation, and with it an even sharper shift. In the 16th century, theologians like Martin Luther and John Calvin redefined work not just as holy, but as proof of divine favor. If you were prosperous, hardworking, and self-denying, it meant you were chosen. If you were lazy, indulgent, or poor, it meant you were damned, or at least suspect. This belief, known as the Protestant work ethic, would later become the bedrock of Western capitalism. Here, the myth evolved again. Success was no longer a reward from society. It was a sign from God. And failure? A moral failing, a kind of spiritual decay. The poor were no longer just unfortunate. They were suspect, and in many ways they still are. By the time the Industrial Revolution reshaped cities into soot-covered engines of commerce, the moralization of labor had fully matured. Factory owners did not need whips. They had ideology. Workers were told they were part of something greater, that discipline was patriotic, that hard work was noble, and yet they were paid barely enough to eat. Children worked in coal mines. Women in textile mills lost fingers and lungs to machines. Men worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. They died young, unnamed. But their morality, we were told, was intact. Meanwhile, the owners, the ones who did not sweat, who did not break their bodies, were praised for their vision, for their cleverness, for creating jobs. The moral ladder had inverted itself. The hardest workers were not the most rewarded, but the most righteous. And yet, that righteousness earned them nothing but fatigue. Nietzsche saw through this with burning clarity. He believed that much of Western morality was a construct designed to keep the strong in check and the weak obedient. What we call good, he argued, often comes from weakness, not strength. Slave morality, he called it. A system that praises humility, suffering, and obedience because it is created by those who lack power. In Nietzsche's eyes, the moral glorification of work was not a virtue. It was a tool, a strategy by which the powerless preserved a sense of dignity, but also a trap, because it kept people from asking better questions. Who profits from this labor? Who decides what work is worth? Who told you that suffering makes you good? And still, the myth endured. In the 20th century, as socialism and capitalism clashed, both systems continued to tie human value to labor. Under communism, the worker became a hero, at least in name. But often, the reality was more brutal. Under capitalism, productivity became God. Even today, in a so-called service economy, we ask people to smile through pain. Retail workers are praised for their emotional labor, teachers for their self-sacrifice, nurses for their compassion, but rarely paid accordingly. Meanwhile, the modern elite has changed clothes. Tech CEOs wear hoodies instead of crowns. Influencers trade in digital clout. Yet one thing remains consistent. Those at the top work the least with their bodies and profit the most. And we still tell ourselves it is because they worked hard. But if that were true, the single mother working 2 jobs would be a millionaire. The refugee who cleans hotel rooms after fleeing war would be on magazine covers. The elder care worker who holds the hand of the dying would own the building she works in. And so we come to the heart of it. The lie of moral labor is not just a historical curiosity. It is a living myth. passed down from pulpits to payroll systems. It teaches the worker to see exhaustion as honor, to see rest as guilt, to accept that suffering is proof of virtue, and that virtue is its own reward. But the truth is colder and harder to swallow. The system does not reward virtue. It rewards power. It always has, and so the myth remains. Beautiful, comforting, and brutal. But now maybe we can begin to unlearn it. If the lie of moral labor has been woven through history, it also finds its roots deep within our minds and hearts. It is not merely a social story told by others. It is a story many of us tell ourselves, often unconsciously. Understanding why this belief holds such power means stepping into the realm of psychology, where ancient wisdom and modern science meet. At the center of this story is a concept called internalized oppression. This occurs when people absorb the negative messages their society sends about their worth and ability. Messages like, "You must work harder," "If you fail, it is your fault," or "Rest is selfish." When internalized, these messages become psychological chains. The hardest workers are not only the lowest paid, but often the most trapped in guilt, shame, and exhaustion. Why do we internalize these beliefs? One answer lies in what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension between what we experience and what we are told we should experience. For example, imagine working long hours but seeing little financial reward. Your mind searches for a way to resolve the conflict. Often, it concludes that the problem must be personal. You must not be working hard enough or deserve less. This self-blame is a form of psychological survival. It preserves your sense of order in a chaotic world, even if that order is false. From a Jungian perspective, this tension touches the shadow, the unconscious part of ourselves that holds our fears, weaknesses, and pain. The shadow whispers, "You are not enough," but society echoes it louder, especially in the realm of labor. Those shadows deepen the experience of exhaustion and invisibility, making rest feel like surrender, and self-care a betrayal. Modern social psychology adds another layer through the idea of social identity theory. We define ourselves partly by the groups we belong to, our class, our profession, our culture. When a group is stigmatized as lazy or unworthy, its members face a painful double bind. To reject the stigma risks isolation. To accept it means accepting diminished worth. This dynamic fuels the relentless grind of the hardest workers. They push not only because of economic necessity, but because their identity depends on proving their worth through work. The myth of moral labor also connects with the ancient archetype of the wounded healer, one who must suffer in order to heal or save others. Nurses, teachers, social workers often embody this archetype, praised for their sacrifice and endurance. But this praise can become a cage, trapping them in cycles of burnout and underappreciation. Their worth is tied not to their well-being, but to their suffering. There is a modern psychological concept that helps explain why many accept this suffering so willingly. The Protestant work ethic has been internalized as a moral compass. Even those without religious belief feel the weight of this ethic as a psychological imperative. Work becomes a way to prove identity and morality. Slacking or resting triggers not just guilt, but existential anxiety, the fear of being worthless or abandoned. We can see this echoed in popular culture, the glorification of hustle culture, the celebration of the grind, the idea that if you are not constantly producing, you are failing. Social media amplifies this by showcasing highlight reels of success framed as the result of relentless effort, pushing many into comparison traps and endless exhaustion. Yet, there is a paradox here. Psychological research on burnout shows that excessive work without rest damages not only health but also productivity and creativity. The more the hardest workers push themselves, the less they often achieve in the long run. Still, the myth insists that rest is weakness, so workers continue down the same path. Why does this paradox persist? Because the myth serves a powerful function. It maintains social order. It justifies inequality by framing it as natural and deserved. The system does not need everyone to thrive. It only needs enough to believe that their suffering means something noble. The ancient Sufi poet Rumi once wrote, "Don't grieve. Anything you lose comes round in another form." What if, instead of grieving our exhaustion and undervaluation, we began to question the framework that glorifies suffering? What if rest and worth were not opposites? In many indigenous cultures, work is part of a cyclical rhythm with life, rest, and community. The value lies not in the intensity of labor, but in the harmony it creates. This ancient wisdom contrasts sharply with the relentless push of modern capitalist morality. By looking at psychology, we see that the myth of moral labor is not just external. It lives inside us. It shapes our self-talk, our fears, our hopes. It teaches us to measure our worth in sweat and sacrifice rather than in dignity and balance. But awareness is the first step toward freedom. Pause here for a moment. What messages about work and worth did you inherit? How do they shape your feelings about rest, success, and failure? Reflecting on these can open doors to new ways of being. In the next section, we will explore the deep emotional and social consequences of holding on to this myth, and how it shapes the way we live, love, and dream. When the hardest workers earn the least, it is not just an economic injustice. It is a wound that cuts deep into the soul. The consequences of this lie ripple far beyond paychecks. They seep into identity, relationships, mental health, and the very way we see our place in the world. Imagine waking each day weighed down not only by physical exhaustion, but by an invisible burden. The belief that your worth is measured solely by how much you sacrifice. Over time, this belief can erode the foundation of self-esteem. You begin to associate your value with pain and productivity, and when you falter, when fatigue wins, when life demands pause, you feel shame. Shame is the shadow companion of the moral labor myth. Psychologists describe this as chronic self-neglect, a state where personal needs are denied because they conflict with an internalized demand to work harder, be stronger, endure longer. It often shows up as burnout, a syndrome marked by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a diminished sense of accomplishment. Burnout is not just tiredness. It is a soul-deep exhaustion that says, "I have nothing left to give." And yet, even in burnout, the myth whispers, "Push harder. Rest is weakness." This internal voice becomes a relentless taskmaster, driving people to ignore signs of illness, depression, or anxiety. Mental health suffers silently, while outwardly the narrative remains one of honor and virtue. This exhaustion does not only affect the individual, it touches families and communities. When someone is consumed by work and guilt, relationships strain. There is less emotional availability, fewer moments of presence, and a growing sense of isolation. The worker becomes a ghost in their own life, seen but not truly known. Socially, the myth sustains systemic inequality. When those who labor hardest are trapped in poverty, it perpetuates cycles of disenfranchisement. Children grow up internalizing the same messages, that worth is toil, and success is divine favor. The psychological inheritance continues. Historically, these consequences are not new. The myth of moral labor has long been a tool of control. In ancient Rome, slaves who accepted their servitude as destiny were less likely to rebel. In medieval Europe, peasants who believed suffering was holy were less inclined to revolt against lords. Today, the modern equivalent may be workers who accept exploitation as normal, believing their sacrifice makes them morally superior or at least deserving of dignity. Yet, beneath this acceptance often lies a quiet rage, a deep sense of injustice. It is a rage that many do not express openly, fearing social judgment or losing the fragile security their labor provides. The tension between acceptance and rebellion creates psychological conflict. It fractures identity. Some workers try to deny the unfairness by redoubling their efforts. Others withdraw, numb, or detach. Both responses can lead to long-term damage. This fractured identity also impacts creativity and growth. When survival is tied to relentless work, there is little space left for dreams, passions, or reflection. The mind becomes a machine, and the heart a ledger. Potential is lost, not only personal potential but collective potential. In literature and mythology, the toll of such a life appears often. The figure of Sisyphus, condemned to push a boulder uphill only to see it roll down again, captures the futility many feel. Albert Camus famously called this the absurdity of human labor when disconnected from meaning. But Nietzsche offered a challenge to this despair. He did not romanticize suffering. Instead, he urged us to question the values that create suffering in the first place. What if the true rebellion is not to endure more, but to reject the terms of the game? In personal relationships, this myth complicates love and intimacy. If your worth is tied to how much you give, you risk losing yourself in others' needs. Boundaries blur. Exhaustion breeds resentment. The hardest workers often become the most isolated, trapped between duty and desire, loyalty and loneliness. Yet, there is hope in awareness. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward healing the wounds the myth has inflicted. Understanding that exhaustion is not a badge of honor, but a signal that something must change opens space for compassion, both for ourselves and others. Pause again here. How has your relationship to work shaped your sense of self? Has it brought connection or isolation, pride or exhaustion? These questions are not easy, but they are essential. When we see clearly the costs of this lie, we can begin to imagine new possibilities, ways of living and working that honor dignity without sacrificing health, that value rest as much as effort, that reward contribution rather than mere endurance. In the next section, we will explore practical tools and mindset shifts that can help untangle this knot, drawing from both ancient wisdom and modern psychology to support healing and transformation. If the myth of moral labor has been with us for millennia, woven into our very bones and beliefs, then unlearning it requires patience, courage, and intention. It means gently dismantling the stories we tell ourselves about work, worth, and suffering, and building new ones rooted in dignity, balance, and authenticity. The first step is awareness. To recognize when the myth speaks inside us, the voice that says, "You must push harder," or, "If you rest, you will fail." This awareness is like turning on a light in a dark room. It does not erase the shadows immediately, but it allows us to see them clearly. One practical tool is mindful journaling. Set aside time each day or week to write about your relationship with work and worth. Ask yourself, what messages about labor do I carry? How do these messages affect my body, mind, and spirit? What would it feel like to rest without guilt? Writing helps externalize these internal voices, making them less overwhelming and easier to challenge. Modern psychology offers powerful tools like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which helps identify and reframe unhelpful beliefs. For example, if you catch yourself thinking, "I have to prove my worth by working non-stop," you can question it. Is this thought true? What evidence do I have? What would I say to a friend who felt this way? Over time, this practice weakens the grip of harmful myths. Alongside these contemporary approaches, ancient wisdom provides rich guidance. The Stoics, for instance, taught the importance of distinguishing between what we can control and what we cannot. Work hard within your control, but accept that external rewards, money, recognition, status, are often beyond it. This mindset can free us from the relentless cycle of striving and disappointment. The Sufi tradition invites us to embrace presence and balance. Rumi's poetry reminds us that life is not just about doing, but being. Rest, joy, love, these are as vital as labor. In their dance, work becomes a part of life's rhythm, not its entirety. Practicing self-compassion is another revolutionary act. When exhaustion or failure comes, instead of judgment, Offer yourself kindness. Acknowledge your limits and honor your humanity. Self-compassion combats the harsh inner critic born of moral labor myths and nurtures resilience. Setting healthy boundaries is crucial. This might mean saying no to extra shifts, carving out time for hobbies, or turning off work emails after hours. Boundaries protect your energy and allow rest to be a sacred part of your life, not a luxury or punishment. In communities and workplaces, advocating for fair labor practices is also vital. Change is not only personal, it is collective. Supporting policies that ensure living wages, reasonable hours, and worker rights challenges the systems that perpetuate inequality. Finally, cultivating a sense of purpose beyond productivity can transform how we view work. Purpose rooted in connection, creativity, or contribution reframes labor from a burdensome obligation to a meaningful expression. When you align work with values, the grind loses its tyranny. Pause to reflect. What small step could you take today to honor your worth beyond what you produce? How might your life change if rest became part of your moral fabric, not a failure? Healing from the myth of moral labor is not a race. It is a journey, a weaving of old wisdom and new insights, a balancing of effort and ease. As we untangle this knot, we reclaim not just our time, but our humanity. As we come to the close of this exploration, it is worth pausing to reflect on the journey we have taken together. We began with a question that touches the core of many lives. Why do the hardest workers so often earn the least? In peeling back the layers, we saw how this is not merely an economic puzzle, but a profound psychological and cultural story, one that has shaped how we see ourselves, our labor, and our worth. For centuries, the myth of moral labor has convinced us that suffering, sacrifice, and endless toil are not only necessary, but noble. It teaches that worth is measured in hours worked, sweat shed, and exhaustion endured. Yet, this ancient story is a lie that hides a deeper truth. Our worth is not tied to how hard we push, but to who we are beneath the struggle. Nietzsche challenged us to question the values we inherit and to create new ones that serve life and growth rather than destruction. To live beyond the grind is to reclaim our dignity, to recognize that rest is not failure but a sacred act of renewal. Throughout history, cultures have offered glimpses of this wisdom: the cycles of work and rest, the honoring of balance, the understanding that life's value cannot be reduced to productivity alone. Modern psychology echoes this ancient insight, showing us how relentless work can fracture identity and soul, while compassion, boundaries, and purpose can restore them. This is not an easy path. It requires courage to dismantle deeply held beliefs, patience to develop new habits, and kindness toward oneself in moments of struggle. But it is a journey worth taking, because at its heart lies the possibility of living fully, not just surviving. Pause now and ask yourself, how might your life change if you allowed yourself to rest without guilt? What new passions, relationships, or dreams might flourish when you are no longer trapped by the myth that labor alone defines your worth? You are more than the sum of your work. You are a human being deserving of dignity, balance, and joy. Embracing this truth is a radical act of self-love and resistance, a way to break free from cycles of exhaustion and invisibility. As we continue this journey together, remember that awareness is the seed of transformation. With each step, you reclaim power, not through more toil, but through deeper understanding and presence. Let this be an invitation to look beyond the surface of effort and reward, to honor your rhythms, to find meaning beyond metrics, to build a life where rest and work dance in harmony, not in conflict. What if, instead of measuring success by how much you endure, you measured it by how fully you live? Thank you for walking this path with me. May you carry these reflections forward with compassion and courage. If this exploration has touched something inside you, if it has sparked questions about how you relate to work, worth, and rest, then you are not alone. Together, we are uncovering a deeper understanding of what it means to live with intention and dignity beyond the relentless grind. Here, we are creating a space for growth that honors emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and meaningful reflection. This is not about quick fixes or surface-level advice. It is about diving deep into the stories that shape us, challenging old beliefs, and discovering new ways to reclaim our personal power. You have the capacity to master your relationship with work and life, to set boundaries that protect your energy, to nurture your worth independent of productivity, and to lead with integrity in a world that often values the opposite. If you resonate with this journey, I invite you to subscribe and join our community. Together, we will explore more insights that blend deep psychology, historical wisdom, and practical tools to help you live with purpose and clarity. This is a shared path of transformation, where we learn not only to survive but to thrive, where we reclaim our power not through force but through presence, where growth happens gently, with patience and kindness. So, as you step forward, ask yourself, how will you honor your worth today? How will you nurture your inner life even as you engage with the outer world? By subscribing, you take a quiet but profound step toward answering these questions, and you join others committed to living more thoughtfully and freely. Thank you for being here. I look forward to continuing this journey with you.